Hello, everyone. My name is Sophia Arendt, and I am a senior analyst at the Global Blockchain Business Council. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth episode of the GBBC's of the Global Blockchain Business Council and Global Digital Finance's Global Leaders Series. This is a weekly global town hall with policymakers and business leaders to hear their insights into the emerging COVID-19 crisis and field questions from members of the community. Today, we are joined by Staci Warden, Executive Director of Global Market Development at the Milken Institute and Board Director at the GBBC, and Tomicah Tillemann, GBBC Board Chair and Founder and Director of the Digital Impact and Governance Initiative at New America, to discuss the impact on and response to the coronavirus pandemic in developing countries and potential opportunities for financial and technological innovation. Staci Warden is the Executive Director of Global Market Development at the Milken Institute, where she leads strategic initiatives on developing capital markets, innovative finance, and access to capital. She also co-founded a global program to train and mentor policymakers in financial policy, now in its fourth year. Staci has spent her career managing, advising, and writing on issues of international finance and economic development. Prior to joining the Milken Institute, she spent 6 years with JP Morgan in London, where she led its public sector client franchise in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and 2 years in New York on the sovereign debt capital markets team. Staci has worked in over 50 countries and has served as a ministerial level advisor on capital market development, sovereign wealth management, debt management, and poverty reduction. She is the chair of the Rwandan Capital Markets Authority and holds several other board and advisory board positions. Our second guest is Dr. Tomicah Tillemann. He is the executive director of the Digital Impact and Governance Initiative at New America. With the support of the Rockefeller Foundation, the Digital Impact and Governance Initiative is developing the next generation of technology platforms to transform the way governments deliver value for citizens. He also oversees the work of the Blockchain Trust Accelerator and the Responsible Asset Allocator Initiative. The Blockchain Trust Accelerator works with organizations to deploy decentralized technology solutions that address governance and social impact challenges worldwide. The Responsible Asset Allocator Initiative Index ranks sovereign wealth and pension funds with combined assets of 20 trillion based on their strategies for managing social, governance, and environmental risks. Tomicah also chairs the Global Blockchain Business Council. He previously served at the State Department as senior advisor to the Secretary of State, leading a team of experts that brought together technology, talent, resources, and partners to build 20 major initiatives in 55 countries. We welcome your questions at any point during today's webinar. Please submit them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And without further ado, I'd like to hand things off to Tomicah and Staci.
Well, Sophia, thank you for that very kind introduction. It is a pleasure to be with you and all of you this morning. We're grateful to the Global Blockchain Business Council and GDF for providing this platform. At the GBBC, we are big believers in transparency, and I will state my biases with regards to this conversation at the outset. Staci Warden is one of my absolute favorite people to talk to for a whole host of reasons. One of which is, in my line of work, you get to spend a fair amount of time, probably more than I deserve, with folks that are extremely smart in one subject, and they can go really, really deep in one subject. Staci is really smart in every subject. I have kind of yet to exhaust the list of things that she can hold forth on with just incredible insight and mental dexterity. And so I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot from this conversation. I'm sure the rest of us will as well. And we have a very important topic. We are living through historic times, and we are experiencing strains on our systems and institutions in the global north, the likes of which we have never dealt with in our lifetimes, certainly. And we are, I think, by virtue of that, largely distracted from the impact that the pandemic is having in the global south and in frontier and emerging economies. We'll get into both sides of that equation over the course of our conversation today, but Staci is really uniquely positioned to help us make sense of what is a very fast-moving situation, its implications at a macroeconomic level, and also the opportunities for innovation and technological change that we could see as a result of the pandemic. So Staci, with that as a background, welcome. I hope you and yours are all healthy and well. And I'd love to get your take at the outset on what are we dealing with here, and particularly what are we dealing with in the global south? How do you see this unfolding?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for that setup for failure on this conversation. If I don't need
hardly.
You know, you're right. It's not something, you know, the global south is really not getting the, apart from China, of course, and other countries in East Asia, we're not hearing about. And in fact, we're asking ourselves questions like, why isn't it worse in India? And why isn't it worse in Africa? And is it because there's a malarial kind of response, or is it because they're younger populations? And doesn't it kind of not make sense? And I am not a health expert, so I'm not going to kind of weigh in on those questions, but I think it's a little bit surprising that the numbers haven't been bigger. And I fear very much that there's some complacency right now around, and that really we're just kind of at the beginning of the exponential curve. You know, so for example, in Africa, there's about 50, you know, this is assuming that these numbers of cases are in any way accurate in any country, which I think we're learning is not the case. But we've got about 15,000, I think, cases in Africa about a week ago. And, you know, that's kind of a beginning of an exponential curve. And the reason I think, I mean, there's so many reasons to be worried about the global south. And I'm worried that we're going to turn around and it's going to be beyond our control before we know it, right? I mean, the petri dish is just ripe for the worst case scenario in the global south. And Africa is a place that I know a little bit better recently than, say, South America and East Asia. But you know, you just think about kind of the ingredients of that cocktail are very dense urban environments, people living on top of each other, big informal economy, people sharing resources like sharing access to water, sharing latrines, a very also just-in-time economy, right? So you're not, you live day by day. You earn money on a day and you spend that money. And if you're a market trader, the money that you make on Monday buys your supplies on Tuesday and feeds your family on Wednesday. Even in this country, right? It is, you know, one of the cruelest things about this is the way that kind of inequality just rears its heads in ways that I never even expect. Like, for example, you can buy things in bulk if you have money. But if you don't have money, you can't buy things in bulk. You can't be in your house with 2 weeks worth of groceries. You even if you have a job and you can afford groceries, you still can't buy 2 or 3 weeks worth of them, right? So then you're forced to go out and go to the store. That you notice here in this country. Imagine what that's like in the global south, right?
Let me ask, just to build on that a little bit, you spoke to some of these dynamics, and I'd love to just unpack them a little bit more. Social distancing is something that is relatively achievable in an environment where people are living in single-family homes. But in a slum or a shanty town, it's a lot harder to pull that off. Stockpiling or purchasing in bulk is feasible if you have a small financial reserve, but much, much more challenging if you're living in a just-in-time world where it's literally paycheck to paycheck or often day to day. What are some of those other dynamics that you think could have a transformational impact, or speak about the two that you brought up in a little greater detail?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that this conversation is about the global south, but I'm also getting a little tired of, you know, the coastal elite, of which I guess I count myself, making fun of people in Pennsylvania and Michigan and these protests against the sequestration. Because I don't think it's, you know, it's called stupidity or whatnot. It's not stupidity so much as it is desperation, right? And if you are in a developing country and you have a choice between 100% starving and some unknown probability of catching a virus that you don't fully understand, you're going to take door number B every single time. And so what I am suggesting, I guess, is that it's not that it's going to be harder to do social distancing. It's going to not happen, the social distancing, because social distancing is a luxury, and it's a luxury that these countries don't have, I guess, is kind of my point. Now,
other interest, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was going to kind of talk a little bit about the Liberia Ebola example, but we can do that at any time.
The other area where we're seeing, I think, a big divergence in what is possible is around the types of fiscal stimulus that governments are able to provide. And if we look at Europe, they are investing very heavily in trying to preserve employment, and they've been relatively effective in that. They've made sure that folks can retain their jobs even as their employers' balance sheets may be looking a lot more challenging. In the US, we've taken a different approach. We primarily focused on trying to provide assistance to individuals, and stimulus checks are going to individuals, and we'll talk about some of the challenges around how that is or isn't working perhaps a little bit later. But both of those strategies are predicated on having the fiscal headroom to be able to write some really big checks and engage in, for the most part, unprecedented deficit spending. That's not really an option for many governments in the global south. And so what types of approaches exist if you can't go either one of those two routes?
Right. And let me just add a little fuel to that fire. Half of the countries in the global south are already what we call kind of severely indebted or dangerously indebted. So you're already starting with very severe kind of interest payments on debt and debt service obligations that can run up to sort of 20% of GDP. So the first thing you might think about doing is not paying that, trying to get a moratorium on that, because that will give you some fiscal space. If I was running a small country in the south, that's kind of one of the first things that I would try to do. You also saw 100 billion by IMF estimates of outflows, emerging market outflows from foreign investors. These are portfolio investors primarily, but you can also imagine foreign direct investments. That money moves a bit more slowly, but you can also imagine a pullback from that as well, right? So you've got this kind of drying up of flows, and at the same time, you've got your biggest export market. Again, and I'm focused a little bit more on Africa than I am Latin America, but China in a slowdown right now, and China not buying the things that they always bought from you. And so your export capacity is also kind of going down. And then if that wasn't bad enough, you've got a lot of oil producing economies, and the oil price is like basically the next futures contract is, sort of famously negative. The one, this is not as weird as people say it is, but in the future,
it's pretty weird.
It's not so weird. It's storage costs, actually. You have to store that stuff. And if the cost of storage goes above the cost of the spot price, then, it gets negative. It's kind of it's weird, but it's not as weird. It's not as weird as $13 trillion of negative yielding sovereign debt. Let's just put it that way. Like, that to me is weird.
Fair.
I'm also trying to study some chemistry so that I understand these viruses. And, it's definitely not as weird as the particle theory and wave theory simultaneous explanation for things. So it's like, economics is not that weird. But all of these things together, just, imagine that kind of cocktail and having to navigate your way through it. And here I do think Liberia is a very good example. And Alan Johnson Sirleaf, who was the Ebola epidemic happened in about 2014, 2016. The last one was in the 90s. So nobody really remembered that at the time. She made some mistakes in the beginning, which she's talking about now very usefully, I find. But she realized a couple of things were very important. First of all, a curfew. So they implemented a curfew from 9 p.m. to, I think, 6 a.m. And that kind of put a damper on all activity. Second, they did a ton of good internal messaging. So they created songs like the Fight Ebola song, et cetera, et cetera. It was also, and and I'm not a religious scholar, so I don't want to speak too sort of confidently about this, but it really hit Islamic communities more hard because of burial rites. So you must wash the body and bury it, my understanding is, within 24 hours. And it was really kind of decimating the more Islamic communities in Liberia. So there was a lot of navigating of political, religious kind of priorities around that, I would say. But what she did, and to your question really, is she realized that she doesn't have the fiscal space at home. And so she swallowed her pride, unlike what a lot of countries are doing right now, and went out hat in hand and said, look, I cannot handle this myself, and we need relief. And countries stepped up pretty quickly and helped get Liberia and surrounding countries out of and so I think that also is what needs to be happening. And the African countries are far more organized around this than the, say, Latin American countries or the subcontinent Asia countries. They are they are showing that they are well organized internally, and they've got all the kind of the big names and the big thinkers and the kind of famous Africans are signing joint petitions and lobbying the IMF, lobbying the G20. And it's been, I think, pretty effective for them.
Where do you see things headed on debt relief or debt forgiveness in some form? There has been, it seems like, a flurry of activity in that space. Is that something that, in your best estimate, we are likely to see materialize in some form in the next little while?
Yeah, so, the devil is in the details on these kinds of things. So, the IMF now has $1 trillion in lending capacity. This is a lot of money. It is 4 times the lending capacity that they had during the global financial crisis. And the reason for that is that they made a lot of decisions and moves to make sure that they had the lending capacity should something else like that happen. So, but 103 countries have gone to the IMF now for emergency assistance. They have 189, I think, member countries. So 103 is a big portion of that. And, $1 trillion seems like a lot of money, but it can be spent quickly, I would say. And so they have a couple of, the IMF, just as a little sort of didactic thing on them, they have a couple of different, what we call windows in order to help countries. So one, they have this window for emergency assistance, and they have rolled this out. They also have a window that they started during the Ebola crisis, actually, that they're now kind of repurposing for this. So that's also kind of a nice thing. And that's also an emergency assistance window. The third thing they have is concessional lending. So they can give money at very low interest rates, loan money at very low interest rates. And this is one of their bigger elements of their capacity. And then they have together a way of kind of coordinating bilateral debt relief and IMF debt relief. And so the G20 did, so the IMF meetings were just last week, and the G20 made an announcement, they call it a communique, on debt relief. And what they did was they gave a debt moratorium to all IDA countries, which are kind of the poorest countries of the world, until the end of 2020. So that looks really good on a communique, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In practice, though, it's not as good as, and this is not to, sort of disparage intentions at all, but the devil is in the details. And a couple of things there are, the 4 hardest hit countries in Africa are South Africa, Morocco, Algeria, and Egypt. Well, those aren't IDA countries, unfortunately. And so they are not going to get the debt relief that they need. They are also very contaminant countries for the rest of the continent, right? They're a very large, because by definition, they're a large part of the economic activity of the continent, and therefore the kind of way, the mechanisms for them to spread contagion are much bigger than, say, a little country like, a tiny country in Africa. More importantly, though, is what does it mean actually to get debt relief? Well, there's no coordinating mechanism for this now. There's no Paris Club to make this happen on the bilateral side, right? The Paris Club hasn't restructured a debt in 5 years. It kind of doesn't even exist right now as a useful international coordinating mechanism. So what this really means is now every country, okay, great, I've got debt moratorium. My bilateral creditors, well, I've got, 12 of those. So now I'm calling up like the Danish Ministry of Finance. Hi, is there somebody I can talk to there? Because I read the communique and I get debt relief. Who's going to do that for me? And, who can I call when the bill comes and I haven't paid it and I get in trouble? For me, I can't even imagine actually how this is going to work. This requires global leadership and global coordination, which, the more skeptical of us might think that doesn't 100% exist right now. The last point on this is that the sovereign and the bilateral debt is not as big as the private sector debt. And also the private sector indebtedness is also, those are higher interest rates, so they're more expensive for developing countries. And what happened, so for example, during the, some of the debt reliefs that the United States led, the Iraq debt relief, for example, because there was a Paris Club agreement, countries could go around, George Bush sent James Baker on a plane and said, look, you need now to give debt relief. You private sector, you London Club, they call it, need to give debt relief because the Paris Club is giving debt relief, right? And so that kind of was a forcing mechanism for private sector creditors to come to the table, which also now doesn't exist. Sorry, that was
Sandra just asked a great question in the chat, which is there any way we can use this moment to push for debt cancellation, or is relief and kind of pushing out of the payments the best we're likely to see under the circumstances?
Yeah, I think these are, it's like boiling the frog in water. You get yourself a little more first, and then you try to get yourself some relief, and then you get some cancellation. I mean, you've got to acknowledge reality around these kinds of things. Like, these countries can't pay, and if they're seeing the kinds of collapses in GDP that we fear, then you're not going to get paid back. And to get on my own personal soapbox about this a little bit, this is why they call it a risk premium. Like, if you're always going to get paid back.
What did you expect when you made these investments?
Totally. Yeah. What did you expect, and why are you getting paid so much, right? Go buy yourself some U.S. Treasuries if you don't want to take any risk.
Well, that's a fair point. Let me ask also about the types of solutions that are emerging right now, because one of the intriguing things that we're seeing as a result of the crisis is that technology is being used in some pretty unprecedented ways. And, especially as you get into tracking, and we can talk about that a little bit, there are some very innovative opportunities to harness tools that have been developed over the last decade and put them to work in resolving different aspects of this crisis. There are also some big challenges, especially in the realm of privacy and rights protection that go along with that. What opportunities are you seeing right now to apply technology constructively, and what's keeping you up at night? What has you nervous?
Okay, so it's unnerving, of course, to be asked questions by somebody who knows far more about the topic that they're asking about than you do. So I'm going to kind of try to turn the tables a little bit and turn this into a conversation between the two of us on that. But maybe to start, I'll just kind of frame some buckets that we could talk about it in. So I think, the first is technology around testing and curing of this virus, which I am obviously not going to have a lot to say about. However, it is clear to me, and I think everybody else, that testing is the most important thing that we should be focusing our efforts on. And it is particularly galling to me, frankly, that South Korea started this drive-through testing program. I mean, we Americans, we invented the drive-through.
We own the drive-through, darn it.
We own the drive-through. It's just not right that they rolled out the drive-through before the United States of America. Anyway, second, there is technology around communications and the importance of that. Informing citizens, keeping them kind of, giving them information that they trust and that they can use. As an aside there, I will say that technology there can be used for kind of good. It can help the situation and exacerbate the situation. So, for example, Singapore from the very beginning was rolling out, and still rolls out 2 SMS messages to everybody, all residents of the country, a day, updating them on what's going on. How many cases, what they're doing, what the laws are. Here's a link you can click to learn more. Here's etc. It's not clear to me that we in the United States want Donald Trump sending us 2 SMS messages a day. Like, I don't think that would be helpful. I think that would be very chaotic and not good for the messaging program. So I guess it's predicated on the fact that you have an adult, consistent, calming, and helpful message. And if you do, then you should be using technology in ways that we are not yet using. The third, I guess, is technology around the spread of the virus and social and distancing and knowing who's had it and who's got it. And there's some examples of like that we can talk about. And the fourth, I think, is just the technology of rolling out a fiscal stimulus and rolling out welfare packages broadly defined. And so that's kind of how I think about it and how technology can be brought to bear. You may have another category as well, but I think that's kind of how I think about it.
Well, I think that's a great taxonomy for us. And let's start at the outset. One of the things we have been struck with as we have looked at this is that virtually every country that has mounted a world-class response to this, or every jurisdiction that has mounted a world-class response, whether that's South Korea or Singapore or Estonia or Taiwan, they are all running their institutions on world-class tech platforms. And that's something that we are certainly not doing in the United States. It's something that most emerging market economies are not doing, although there are some interesting counterexamples, and the India stack is maybe the most prominent of these. You do see some really cutting-edge technological innovation coming out of India in terms of the way their public sector is utilizing tech. But that has been a really stark disparity that we have witnessed as we've dug into this a little bit. And the ability to very rapidly, on an agile basis, channel information, resources, and people where they need to go as a result of having access to that infrastructure is a pretty big deal. And to what extent do you think it is going to be an imperative emerging from this crisis for countries to develop better technology systems? Is that something that is going to, along with rebuilding economies, be one of the vehicles that we utilize as a means toward greater resilience? Because they seem to be proving pretty valuable in the handful of nations and jurisdictions that do have them right now.
Yeah, I think it absolutely will be a priority, and I think that is good and also a little bit scary. So when you think about China versus, say, France, you know, in France, and now they're rolling this out in Chile as well, you get a little passbook, you know, when you are sort of declared COVID-free or potentially immune. And that little passbook lets you go where you want, and if you want to go in some place, you show them your passbook. Well, in China, you know, it doesn't exactly work that way. They have a barcode, you know, they've got a barcode payment system, which they developed, you know, as a result of the two big tech platforms, private sector tech platforms that are there. And, oh, I just lost your hand. Let me put you back there. Then, so what they have in China is, you know, on your phone, you've got a red or a green or a yellow light. And if your phone is red, when you put it on that barcode that's outside of your apartment building, you're not leaving your apartment building. Like, you're not leaving. The door doesn't open for you because your phone does not get you. It's, you know, it's a lot more efficient and a lot better for kind of social distancing. And, you know, you combine that with kind of facial recognition, and what you get is a very effective monitoring and virus curve flattening device. You also get a lot of other things that are a little bit scarier to us in terms of, you know, being in the West, though, right? And I think, though, that leaders, especially leaders of particular tendencies, are going to look at those examples in China, and they're going to say, I'd like me some of that. I definitely would. And when it will be good for protecting the health and safety of my citizens, but also, you know, it's probably not so bad to have in my back pocket for whenever I might need it.
Staci, your sound is going in and out a little bit, and so I don't know if there's anything we can do to address that, but I will flag it for you in hopes that whatever can be done will be done. Okay. And I want to dig in on the point that you just made a moment ago, which is that we have seen leaders, for a variety of, in my view, pretty legitimate reasons, become very critical of the Chinese model in the last couple of years. And there's no question that the Chinese have built a framework for incorporating big data, technology, and government, and there are some problems with that framework. But while leaders in the West have been quite critical of that, what they haven't done to date is offer an alternative. And I think one of the key needs right now is that leaders in the West that are focused on privacy nominally, that are focused on human rights nominally, come together and start to put forward some alternatives to the system that's been developed in China, which is being rolled out in many instances to a growing number of Belt and Road countries, because the Chinese have been pretty forward-leaning and trying to export their technology. And again, you can't fight something with nothing. And I don't know, frankly, that it's even fair or reasonable for Western leaders to be that critical of countries adopting those systems unless and until they put forward a more compelling solution. Now, I think there are ways to do that with open source technology. There are ways to provide greater levels of transparency and accountability, but we seem to be behind when it comes to that game. Is that your assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would ask you to tell us a little bit about some of those ideas, but I think let me agree with you first. And in particular, I think you make a very good and not very well-known point about Belt and Road, which is this kind of cyber element to it. And it's a view of what the internet should look like. And that view is not one of an open access view of the internet. It's very much a state-controlled view of what the internet is. And they go to countries and say, you need the infrastructure, and you need, fiber optic cables, and you can get all of these kind of fun things. But what we're going to build for you is what we have. It's not going to look like what they have in the United States. And so that's a very tempting proposition for countries as well, developing countries who would prefer a bit more of that kind of state level control. Now, I do think in the response, it cannot be just a public sector Western response. It also has to be a private sector Western response. And one of the sledgehammers that we do have are companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon saying, no, I don't play in those kinds of systems. Like, if you want to access my platform, you can't come, I have no idea what I'm talking about technically here, obviously, but you can't come with that internet address that comes from an internet like that. You just don't get to play in my space. And I think that's, that's a solution I think that would work, but, getting something coordinated like that is fraught, let's just say, for sure.
Well, it is interesting. In the countries that seem to be doing really well in responding, you have a couple of common denominators. Everyone has a system in place for digital identity. Everyone has mechanisms in place for data exchange. Everyone has mechanisms in place for high quality, high speed digital payments. And those foundational pieces, which then serve as kind of the base layers into which you plug a whole series of applications and services, just aren't present in the United States and aren't present in a number of Western countries that like to think of themselves as pretty technologically advanced. And so it certainly would suggest that there's room for growth. There's going to be some work that has to be done in that space if we want to do better next time. But,
oh my God. Oh my God. And there is just such low-hanging fruit as well. I mean, the United States is an outrage. It's really an outrage in our payment system and the way that forget the fact that we had to wait however many days so Donald Trump could put his signature on a check. The appalling thing about that story was not, although I found that appalling as well, was not the signature part, it was the check part. Like, seriously, we're sending checks. These people that are hanging on by their fingernails. And well, I got for my TurboTax, I had some money coming back last year, so TurboTax for a fee, open that bank account for me, like send it there. Oh, but that bank account didn't actually exist. That was just a one-off thing, but like, I didn't know. Okay, send me my check. Well, I didn't pay taxes last year, so, you can't find me. And this system is programmed in COBOL, and we don't have real-time payments. So, the Fed, who has its own system, so its own kind of commercial view about how this should work, is also kind of regulating, is saying, well, we do our batch once a day. We collect all of the payments, and then we put them in a clearinghouse, and we net them out, and that's how we do it. So you're going to wait a couple of days for your check. Whereas, like, in poor countries, Turkey and Morocco, I think, and Ghana, and not to mention every other Western rich country, India for sure, you just get a payment right away. It's called a real-time payment system. It's not complicated. And here we do have that in certain cases, but like, if you want the government to start using, like, Venmo, to make all of the payments to citizens, and that's kind of like what the option is. It's completely ridiculous. And this needs to be done for financial inclusion and welfare reasons, completely apart from this, this virus. But I think if we're looking for silver linings, that's one area where I think this could drive some real changes, where the genie, kind of gets out of the bottle and it's very hard to put back in. And I think the clamoring about, why did somebody in New Zealand get their payment in 15 seconds? Why am I waiting 4 days and you don't even know if and why did I get 2 payments? I mean, the whole thing has been completely,
Yeah.
just,
Well, we've seen, I mean, obviously you have Alipay and WeChat in China. In the US, there was talk in one of the early iterations of the stimulus bill of creating a digital dollar, which was a big deal. And there's been a lot of movement around central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, in the last couple of months. And then Libra has come out in the last few days with a new version of its white paper that is intended to be far more compliant with regulatory concerns.
Yeah.
If I push you to make a prediction on this, how long is it going to take before we have access?
Mm-hmm.
How long is it going to take before we have access to better alternatives? If we have a similar dynamic, heaven forbid, in 2-3 years, will people have access to digital payments that are real time and effective at that point?
2 to 3 years, that is hard. Look, I think that the central bank digital currency movement will get a big boost from this for sure. The fact that it had its 3 hours of day in the sun on a Sunday afternoon as part of this bill before it got kind of killed and taken out again is already saying something, because it wouldn't have ever even been considered before. And I think we will look around and we'll see how much better other countries, poor countries. We have the deepest financial system in the world, and we're really mucking this up. The fact also that, at the small business level, that we have done this through an SBA program, which, God love the SBA, of course, and God love the banks that are participating. This got, dumped on them in, just a matter of days that they had to scramble for this. But you were forced to, if you had an SBA bank already, then you were in an okay position and you had your act together and you can get the money. But God forbid, if you banked with a bank that wasn't an SBA bank, or you didn't have a good credit relationship already with the bank, then we made it onerous for the banking system regulatorily to make those payments. They had to do all kinds of KYC, and you're not going to do know your customer and anti-money laundering kinds of things. You're not going to do that for a customer that you don't already have, especially when you are. It's not about the cost. It's about the cost, but it's not about the cost so much as that you are the risk that you're holding if you get something wrong there, right? So that's this over-reliance on the banking sector can be, is inefficient and kind of not fair to the banks as well. So a central bank digital currency allows you, it is not, and I think this is a common misconception, it does not mean that you never use the banking sector again. It just means that you have other alternatives and a more digital framework to make things, faster.
Mark Blick wrote in with a great question, which unfortunately is proving to be a matter of life and death, and it's about supply chains. And how do you think supply chains are going to shift? You mentioned that in emerging markets and developing economies, things are a lot different right now because the goods that they would normally sell to China aren't necessarily going to China the same way. Are we going to see greater self-sufficiency in manufacturing and supply chains? Will countries look to reshore and onshore some of the capacity that in the past they've been content to export? And theoretically, could tools like blockchain be used to provide greater transparency in supply chains that at the moment are looking really opaque, and certainly around personal protective equipment have proven to be tragically opaque? It's been very, very hard to figure out where goods are and who owns them and where they're headed.
Right. So the answer to your last question is absolutely. And I think it would be interesting to talk a little bit more about how that might work. But I think the answer to the first part of your question is yes and no, but probably no, because here's something that I find particularly outrageous. But of course, I come from more the developing country position. If I was a parliamentarian in Europe, I might feel differently. But the fact that Europe has put a moratorium or a ban on exporting any kind of, COVID type equipment, health equipment, emergency equipment, and Africa bought all of that stuff from Europe, all of that stuff. And so now that's a very, very deleterious example of how the collapse in global supply chain, and that's by policy. That's not by, anything else can be, kind of one man for himself can really be to the detriment of developing countries. But to your question of, will it be kind of more of a country model, a stay-at-home model, and no more global supply chains? I think, in the medium term, not so much, because the fact of the matter is that you've got to pay somebody in Michigan $35 an hour to do something, and you have to pay somebody in Africa or China like $2 an hour to do something, right? I mean, the cost discrepancy, especially when you're going through some economic troubles, is just so huge that you're going to continue to kind of, those global supply chains, I don't think will be as devastated in the medium term as they are in the short term. And if I took a particularly kind of optimistic view on things, I might argue that companies will see and have seen very clearly that they have an overdependence and over-reliance on China, that they might seek to diversify that supply chain. And that could be very good for, already the trade war, as you saw, was very good for Vietnam and Malaysia and, and whatnot, because the supply chains kind of morph and change. So if I was running a big company, I would say, look, couldn't somebody in Senegal also make this? Couldn't somebody in, Uruguay also be a backup, so that I've got a little bit more of a diversification for the things that I need, and not just China.
Well, you raised a really good point, and Redwan also sent in a question on this. Markets aren't functioning the way you would hope they would function right now. And in part, that's because there's a lot of imperfect information out there that is leading markets to behave in weird ways. But we're also seeing some interesting initiatives emerge. 18F in the US, which is one of our agencies that does tech for the federal government, helped to create a marketplace that's making it easier to source personal protective equipment, for example. We have created a repository out of my team at New America called the Pandemic Response Repository on GitHub, where we're pooling a whole host of open source technology solutions that are now being exchanged across jurisdictions, and it's making it easier to solve some of the breakdowns that have occurred in traditional tech dispersal right now. But do you think there will be openings for more transparent marketplaces, saner marketplaces that make it easier to match buyers and sellers in an accountable way going forward? Is that one of the things that we're likely to see, so that we don't have quite so much price gouging and, unfortunately, in many instances, people going without equipment that they urgently need in order to save lives?
Yeah, I mean, I want to ask you what some of those initiatives are that you are showcasing, because I think that's very interesting. But I think that there will be more niche marketplaces for sure. And again, back to your point on technology, and in particular kind of on blockchain, the blockchain, for all the hype and all of the skepticism, does offer in a kind of a perfectly rolled out world a number of very good features for managing this kind of crisis, right? So the idea is that you can, that different parties can help you assert who you are and what your identity consists of. If you are, a refugee, or if you don't have an address, that you can share pieces of your identity in a kind of what we call a self-sovereign way. You might want to be able to share with a health worker something, or with a somebody concerned about social distancing, a government agency, some other piece, but without having to share kind of everything that you know. That when you are in a marketplace context, you have an idea of where, if you are giving money charitably, for example, the idea that you could, and of course, the execution of this is very incipient still, but that you could trace where your money actually is going, so that you could ensure that it is going where you said it was going to go, or that you can understand the provenance of money that came to you and where it has been. All of these things are very, it's a profound and important tool, I think, for the kinds of things that we're trying to solve. We need to get busy and making it happen, I would say. But tell me, what kinds of things are you, because I know you're sharing them with governments or making them available in a very easy way to access some of these tools. So like what is on your repository?
Well, for a long time now, we have been operating on the assumption that our public institutions have been designed in the 19th century. They're using technology from the 20th century, and they're trying to solve problems in the 21st century, and that just hasn't been going so well. That's been, again, a long-term thesis for me and our team. What we've seen in the last couple of weeks and months is that this has come into tragically stark relief as a result of the coronavirus. And to the extent the virus has done anything, it's to speed up the trend among governments to trying to do things better, processes that would have previously taken months or years, and procurement structures that were extremely rigid and extremely reluctant to look at new ways of doing business are all of a sudden wide open for change. And so we have, together with our partners at the Rockefeller Foundation and an array of governments around the world, been working to create open source technology platforms that will exist as digital public goods and be available to any jurisdiction that wants to provide better services for their citizens to roll out very quickly. And now the exciting thing that we've seen over the last couple of weeks and months is that we've identified jurisdictions around the world that are willing to take that same approach in development of their own technology and share the tools that they are creating for pandemic response with everyone else, because they're smart enough to recognize that you can't defeat the virus anywhere without defeating the virus everywhere. And so what we have done with the Pandemic Response Repository is start exchanging tech platforms, start exchanging code between jurisdictions. And if you look, for example, at New Jersey's Coronavirus Information Hub, it's a fantastic coronavirus information hub. New Jersey has had some other tech challenges, but the team that built their information hub did a spectacular job. And they work with us to make it available on an open source basis. And if you look at Alabama's Coronavirus Information Hub now, you will see that other than a few very minor formatting differences, it is New Jersey's Coronavirus Information Hub. And jurisdictions are able, exactly, but communities can share those tools back and forth. So we're seeing that happen in real time with coronavirus response. We think the next stage of this is to drive that same approach to innovation across our public sector institutions. And looking at some of the layers I was speaking about earlier, whether it's digital identity or information exchanges, or payments, or even tax and finance and voting, a whole array of different challenges that governments are going to face as a result of this. We need to start open sourcing the solutions to those challenges and making them available on a modular, interoperable basis so that governments everywhere can take advantage of them. That's a very different way of doing business, but we've been really encouraged by what has occurred over the last few weeks and months, which would suggest that we're moving in the right direction on this. Things are going to happen, and perhaps more quickly than we would have anticipated.
It's like
there are, of course, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just going to say it's a decentralized implementation system of a decentralized technology. It kind of it goes nicely together.
Well, and what we're seeing as a consequence of this is that the best you're going to do in most cases is an 80% solution. But if you can build a really good 80% solution and make that available on a decentralized basis, then every community can customize the last 20% of that solution to meet their specific needs. And it allows you kind of the best of both worlds. You can operate very quickly and very efficiently without having to build everything from the ground up, but you can still tailor different platforms toward local circumstances, which is a big help.
Right. It does bring up, though, I think another area of discussion, which is the importance of kind of global coordination around standards and just making sure that, so in payments, for example, some of the really tricky things right now, it gets quite technical, but just making sure that it's like everybody has the same API framework, all players have the same API framework. That also will make things so much easier for startups to build payment solutions or credit solutions or whatever it is in that world, that internationally, that the barcode standards are the same, so that you can make payments across borders if you're using barcode technology. That kind of thinking and that kind of weedy coordination is going to be critical, I think, when you're trying to roll out a global response for something like this. So, you're enabling, in a way, Alabama and New Jersey to share, because you provided something that was similar enough. You got that 80% right that they could tweak. But what I fear is that the 80% is very different in very different jurisdictions on a lot of these tech platforms, and we'll all suffer as a result of that.
Well, it's certainly a very real issue, and we've seen this work between Alabama and New Jersey. We've seen it work with solutions that were developed in Tokyo that are now being used in San Francisco, and an array of others. But I think the point you touch on is absolutely crucial, and it goes in some ways to the effectiveness of our institutions right now. We have a lot of international architecture, a lot of international systems that were developed in the aftermath of the Second World War. And frankly, they don't seem like they are holding up particularly well in a digital world. And we had a number of questions come in about the World Health Organization and how the World Health Organization could be redesigned to do its work a little bit better. Do you think there's going to be an opportunity, and I think this relates directly to standards, and Sandra sent in a very good question about fintechs and emerging economies and the future they're going to face. My view is that a lot of that is going to be dependent on whether we can get good standards in force and good institutions that are going to create an ecosystem, a global ecosystem, in which smaller players can build alongside bigger players. But do you think there's going to be a moment when all this is hopefully starting to taper off a little bit, and the crisis is over, and we're back in our offices as opposed to in our basements and dens? Do you think that we will see things shift, and you will have a push to redesign our international system and our institutions in ways that will be a little more fit for purpose in the 21st century?
I think I might say more confidently yes on a political economy process field than maybe an institutional field. So I think, for example, the way that we do regulations will change as much as maybe the regulations themselves, for example. So, right now, I mean, I'm being a little bit glib, but if you want to make a change and the SEC makes a change, they write some rules, they put it out for comment for 6 months, and people comment on it, and then it's the new regulatory environment for the next 10 years. Like, that kind of thing is not going to survive. And it's already, we've seen chipping away at that, but that regulatory process will be much more about A/B testing. And, we see in the fintech space, of course, these regulatory sandboxes and just new ways of, and a lot more, I think, regulatory forbearance we will also see, to let, 1,000 flowers bloom and let more failure happen than you might have thought of in the past, right? I mean, one of the reasons that M-Pesa, famously took off in Kenya was because it was regulated by the telco, not regulated by the central bank, right? So it had a little bit of room to a little bit of runway, to kind of get going. And I think that I'm not sure to what extent institutions will change and morph. I hope, and they need to in certain ways, but I think that the way that they approach how they do their job will have to become more agile and more agile, I would say, mostly.
Well, I think that is something that we can certainly hope for. Maybe on a closing note, Donato wrote in asking about how we're going to see innovation change in the healthcare sector, and whether there will be opportunities to develop new, more agile solutions in the healthcare sector, like pulse oximeters, to maybe provide higher standards of care at much lower price points. But is that hopeful, or are we going to see a new wave of innovation emerge from this? Do you think there's a prospect that especially frontier and emerging economies can help solve some of these challenges that we've been wrestling with in the global north for a long time?
Yeah, I think this is a big way where the genie is out of the box and the genie is going to stay out of the box. And that is particularly true in telemedicine, that insurance companies are not letting doctors do things by telemedicine that now they are letting them. That's just never going to go back. It's never going to go back. So you can, Kaiser's always been a bit better than a lot of places in the United States, but I had an issue last week and I thought, I'm a little bit miserable, but am I miserable enough to go to the hospital and maybe but no, I got on the phone, 35 questions from a registered nurse later. They wrote me a prescription and, I had it in a way that I just don't see that going away. I also think to the point about the WHO, I think it's outrageous, of course, that we're talking about cutting their funding, but imagine how it works now. And imagine how IMF, the spring meetings and the IMF sending missions to countries and the fall meetings and all of that, I don't think that's going to go back to exactly the way it was before. I sit on the board of the Rwandan Capital Markets Authority. I go to Kigali, there's 4 board meetings a year. I go to Kigali maybe twice, and 2, I don't go to at all because they have me on a Polycom in the middle of a conference table, and it was just a disaster. But now I'm probably not going to go to Kigali at all. And I'm going to go to all 4 board meetings because we're going to do them by Zoom. And there's nothing lost about that, and when I go to Kigali, it'll be for other reasons. And I think the IMF missions will be like that. I think coordination around the WHO and decision-making will be like that. People will realize that they can save money and help the planet and make decisions faster because of video conference calls like the one that we're doing right now.
Well, we couldn't ask for a better note on which to conclude this conversation, that maybe from all of the very real pain and sorrow and suffering that's going on right now, we will see some lasting improvements in the way that our institutions, organizations, and businesses operate. Staci, it is always a privilege to chat with you, and I will say for those of you at home, Staci, among her many other talents, is probably the single most formidable moderator in Washington that I've ever encountered. So you really should have, you want to see a conversation where Staci is driving it. But this was, I think if you can't have that, the next best thing. And really, we are grateful to you for sharing your insights. And Sophia, we will hand it back over to you and the team.
But can I
Please.
Thank you very much. And I need to plug my I'm gone. No, I need to plug the
No, you're still here. We can hear you.
Okay, great. COVID-19 AfricaWatch.org website that the Milken Institute is putting together to follow.
It's awesome. I've seen it. It's great.
Yeah. And it's not about the Milken Institute at all. It is about getting the best analysis and the best data and the best information out to anybody that could use it. So please do check it out and follow it on COVID_Africa on Twitter. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Staci and Tomicah. That was an excellent conversation, and it has been great to hear you shed some light on the impacts of this pandemic and also the opportunities for growth and innovation. I know we certainly look forward to continuing this conversation and working together as a community to address some of the opportunities.
Thanks, Sophia.
Thanks, Sophia. Thanks, Staci.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who joined today's webinar. A recording of this webinar will be made available online shortly, and we can also circulate the links to the COVID-19 Africa Watch site. We look forward to welcoming you all back for the next episode of the Global Leaders Series, which will take place on April 28th at 9 a.m. with Dr. Jamila Mahmood, Undersecretary for Partnerships at the International Federation of the Red Cross. Feel free to follow GBBC and GDF online for updates and to register for upcoming webinars. Thank you so much, everyone.